So welcome to the full day of the London conference. For those of you who joined us last year, you'll know that we've expanded the conference out a little bit and have been able to stretch it over a day and a half and have a full session with as many of you as could join us as possible yesterday, and a series of dinners, which I hope you found went well and that you enjoyed. I thought we had a great conversation kicking us off on global leadership. I'm not going to try to do any précis of it right now. I'm delighted that the Foreign Secretary, the UK Foreign Secretary, could join us afterwards. And I found his comments on Europe in particular, for those of us in the UK that keep listening somewhat forensically to what British politicians are saying about Europe, I thought it was interesting as well. We'll come back to it. But we are going to try, this big conference is a chance for Chatham House to try some things it doesn't always get to try out in a year. And in particular, we'll be doing some polling when it comes to the third session, chaired by Philip Stevens. So you'll have a bit of time to make sure your app is working and ask questions to Laurel amongst others. And Laurel said she'll be standing somewhere nearby if anyone's getting questions about the app or how to use it. But it's got the program and other things on there, but it also has a practical purpose, which is to be able to do some polling in a couple of sessions here. We'd like to hear your views. Just to remind those of you who weren't here yesterday, this is a conference on the record, and it is being live streamed, and you can tweet or do anything else you want about your commentary of the event today, so please feel free to do so. And I do want to say, just to repeat my words of thanks to our sponsors who are listed here, but in particular Chevron, who is a founding sponsor, and AIG, a lead sponsor again this year, and then to Bloomberg and BP. Bloomberg will be hosting us for dinner this evening. Delighted to have BP's support as well for this conference. And yesterday evening, Diageo enabled us to have that lovely PIMS, although sadly it wasn't outside, it was inside. But there we go. We were a little worried about the weather. And of course the FCO, who's helped us be able to use this great venue to be able to have the meeting with you today. Finally, as all of our moderators know, this is very much a dialogue and an open dialogue where we want to engage all of you in a conversation. We have our panelists, we have our speakers who are kicking off, but we have encouraged our moderators to draw you in as much as possible, as you did last year, which was fantastic as well. And the two key purposes of this conference, best practices nationally and cooperation internationally on the global challenges we face. This is a chance to go big at this conference, to think beyond the headlines, and we really want to take advantage of your insights from around the world. This is a London conference that, as you saw last night, has brought people from all corners of the world to talk about the common problems they face. In our last challenge, we'll get to solutions in the last session. Heather, I've taken a little bit of your time, but I'm sure you can grab 5 minutes from the next session. John's sitting there, and he'll nod. But Heather Graby, you're going to kick off just a short conversation at the beginning, which is not so much on a global issue, but something that's very concerned to all of us, which is Europe. But from the Open Society Institute, Heather Graby, long friend of Chatham House, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, you'll have noticed that this is the only session in this conference on a region of the world rather than on a global issue. And that's for several reasons. One is that the EU has been a very enthusiastic and, for a long time, effective contributor to the creation of the global public goods that Joe and I were speaking about yesterday, on climate, on providing peacekeeping troops, humanitarian assistance, sustainability. But now the EU is faced with an arc of instability. It's very preoccupied, very distracted by enormous crises to its east and its south. And this is really changing the view of Europe in the world, even among policymakers. In the 10 years that I've been in Brussels, I've noticed a big shift. 10 years ago, the EU was very proud of its normative power in the world and its transformative power in its neighborhood. It had just taken in 12 new countries which were had been transformed by their process of reforming to join the European Union. It was starting up the neighborhood policy, very much promoted by Carl Bildt, who'll be speaking this morning. Whereas now, there's a really noticeable hyper-realism that has crept in, a sense of, well, what can we really do? Our powers are limited, the crises are too big. We're entering a very different mindset. Also, very different mindset at national level, with rising populism in the member states, which of course closes minds of the public, reduces support often for external policies that are effective, makes people look much more at the problems at home, and tending to look at the neighbourhood as a source of problems rather than the EU's realm in which it must engage with partners. So we're going to talk about these issues this morning, starting with Carl Bildt, longtime Foreign Minister of Sweden, and of course before that, the Prime Minister of Sweden, who brought Sweden into the European Union, and then Ambassador Vansala Alawi. So, Carl, you've been sitting in the Foreign Affairs Council for 8 years. You were a godfather of the Eastern Partnership. Of course, you were heavily involved in peace building in the Balkans, which was the cradle of the European Common Foreign and Security Policy, which is now, of course, this year being reviewed, the strategic review that Federica Mogherini is now undertaking. How do you see the outlook going forward? Can the EU regain momentum in the East, or will, in fact, Russia's taking of Crimea and the onward push actually cause the EU to retreat further?
Depends. Depends on what is going to happen also in the internal side, because as you said, we're fighting. You can say we have three major issues that we are dealing with in Europe at the moment. We have Putinism in the East, we have jihadism in the South, and we have populism at home. And dealing with the populism at home is rather important. And that goes to the issue of leadership. Can we mount sufficiently effective policies to deal with other two issues? I think we can. As you said, our transformative powers, we've been talking about those. It was easier, of course, in Central Europe, needless to say. I think there was perhaps the belief that it was going to be equally easy in the East and the South. That was never going to be the case. Much more difficult cases when it comes to the transformation of societies and economies. That is the essence of what the European Union does. I mean, the European Union is not the thing that sort of invades countries and believes that in 2 years you fix everything. The essence of the European Union is more geoeconomics, long-term transformation of economies and societies. And of course, both in the East and the South, extremely different as they are. The East is in Europe, the South is not. It's much more long-term. We are up against other forces that are more challenging. But my hope is that we will keep the course, understanding the realities, be aware of the magnitude of the challenge, and not the least be aware of the fact that failure will spill out over or into our own areas as well.
And of course that failure will affect the whole of Europe, but member states feel it differentially. They have very different views on the East and the South, depending on where they are geographically, the other influences on them. What are the prospects for maintaining unity at, for example, the summit in 3 weeks' time that will decide on continuing sanctions? What's your prognosis?
No, I mean, that's very true. If you take two countries like Estonia and Portugal, they have slightly different views on relationship with Brazil. To put it in those terms, and you can turn that argument around in the other direction. That is sometimes seen as a weakness. If you're sitting around the table, as I've been doing X numbers of years, it's a strength, because every nation brings its own perspective to the table, and that over time increases understanding. Sort of the Estonian perspective on Brazil does change, and the Portuguese perspective on Russia does change over time. So I'm fairly optimistic. I think when you'll see the ministers sitting down, or the prime ministers and or the heads of state and government and the European Council, and I think they will come out with a conclusion on the sanctions issue, which I think is going to be, from my point of view, rather satisfactory.
Okay. Very glad of your optimism. Ambassador Vansala Alawi, what's your perspective on the South? Is the EU too much focused on the East? We've seen very different kinds of engagement over since 2011 from the EU, and at the moment there's a huge focus on migration. Some short-term measures have now been agreed, which I must say look rather like a sticking plaster on very deep wounds that the EU hasn't been able to staunch in terms of conflict in Africa, also in the Middle East. What kinds of issues should the EU be engaging the Southern Mediterranean on? What should it really be focusing on?
Well, to start with, the Southern equation, as Carl Bildt has said, is basically different from what we see in the East. We're in front of non-state actors surge, which are threatening the existence even of states, and especially of the Arab state system. And it seems to me that the South dynamics set the tone and oblige Europe to be only responsive. And we do know, and this is perhaps a very third short remark, that sometimes the challenges are Europe's own making, and I'll make it clear in a moment. No need to dwell, of course, on the chaos of the region. It's largely described and especially perceived. Perception is important. We perceive it somehow differently. But we do know that the two main perceived threats in Europe are, of course, migration and terrorism. But these are not new. What is new is the scope, the intensity, the violence that it has been taken. And it is perceived mainly, it has been perceived for long as a threat to European prosperity and identity, but as well security. And not only by the rise in far-right parties. It was really shared by some of the opinion. So I don't think we need really to dwell too much on terrorism as well, because what we notice is that the surge of the last attacks, whether is it in UK, France, or Denmark, are made by young Europeans from migration descent. So there's something wrong, probably, with the policy migration across Europe, which have been rather restrictive than integrative, and which failed to address the grievances and the claim of the second and third generation just for sometimes a decent life. And of course, added to that, we have the spillover and implications from the surge of Daesh and the fear which is materializing of the young European engaged in Syria or Iraq and coming back to Europe and North Africa to create and expand terrorism. So it seems to me that if we come to the strategies, short of a Marshall Plan type approach, which is totally unrealistic nowadays, I think that the era is not for big strategies. They can't be implementable, and Europe is too divided and has too many concerns in its own. And it seems to me that the occurrences of the Arab upheavals at a moment where Europe was deeply stuck in its own crisis, including the crisis of democracy. We tend to forget that. And the rise of the Indignados and Podemos and so forth, prevented Europe from having creative thinking to respond properly to these vast movements, which has been probably misperceived. Beyond that, it seems to me that the intervention in Libya has been detrimental to the stability of the region, because it unleashed the competition between the factions within and extended to the Sahel, linking and giving the opportunity of the affiliates of Al-Qaeda and now of ISIS to link with the homegrown African terrorist movements. So not providing for the day after has been a crucial, mistake. So having said that, what could be the answers? Well, the answers, it seems to me, have to be really, unfortunately, case by case. And probably Europe still needs to focus on a comprehensive approach, despite the failure of the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership Scheme, and probably the patching up of a neighborhood policy, which doesn't seem up to the level to address the tremendous challenges that we are facing right now. Probably on a case-by-case, comprehensive. But it seems to me that it should probably focus on the eras of stability. There are a few. My country is one of them. And probably could capitalize on the positive move that Morocco has been doing, even with Africa, helping in Mali, and expanding the reforms to the religious field. Of course, it's a very long-term strategy, but I don't think we can progress without contemplating this. As well, probably Europe needs more consistency. As we see it from outside, it needs to have more coordination, not only among European states, but within European policies themselves. We have seen the guéguerre between Catherine Ashton and Bernardino Leon, who was probably prevented from carrying out properly his own mission. And it needs probably more coordination, as more transatlantic coordination. We don't talk about that, but it's crucial as well for the whole Mediterranean to have the US involved in answers. And probably it may need a beyond, coordination to focus on the link between development and security in a totally different way from one-size-fits-all that has prevailed, and especially to focus on the large spectrum from education to know exactly what are the grievances of this youth, because this is a problem we don't want to forget. That's what started the whole issue, in Tunisia with the burning of the young unemployed. So employment, jobs are still central, and you will have no sustainable security without addressing these problems, because the populations in the southern Mediterranean have to have vested stakes in their own societies and be part of the security scheme and security apparatus, including intelligence. That's why we are trying in Morocco, for instance, to involve the population as part of the system. And it seems to me that for Europe, sorry to repeat myself, defense and security starts at home. Yeah. And you really have to contemplate, your policy toward this, because the Maghreb and the Muslim world is largely inside Europe, and you tend to forget that. Mm-hmm. You tend to deny this multicultural aspect of Europe, and put it aside doesn't help. And you have as well, of course, the relationship with the countries of origin and the countries which seem now to convey more instability and the arc of crisis expanding, having the regionalization of this terrorist group and the East expanding to the West, also, yes. And of course a sort of contagion, even in North Africa, which was supposed to be the heaven of more stability than yes. the rest.
Well, thank you. You seem to have several lessons, in fact, for the strategic review of foreign policy that's going on, which perhaps haven't been in the debate that much. One is the role of non-state actors, and also from your role in the dialogue on peoples and cultures of the Euro-Mediterranean area, the need to engage them. But also, as you were saying, joining up of internal and external policies, that you can't have a migration policy which is detached from foreign policy considerations. That's also going to be very important for the review. But is there something specifically that you'd like to see coming out that is not present in EU policy? The EU has plenty of different kinds of policies. Is it mainly about joining them up, or is there something that's completely missing?
I think you have to do both. There are a few things which are quite constructive, and especially in the research area. We do have now, this research area about the transformations in the Arab world. Of course, it's a long-term strategy, and the Arab world doesn't have the capacity to do it on its own. And then you have the comparative elements. I'm part, of this, on this policy board of this transformation, political, economic, social, and security, in the South. But at the same time, I think it has to be to push and to support the economic renovation, of the whole. Because even in Morocco, we thought we have been spared by the crisis, but unfortunately, given our very tight links with Europe, we are experiencing now a difficult moment. But I think much more than that, there is a change in nature of the partnership, which is compulsory. It's not a question of degree. You really need to have a more balanced partnership, probably to listen more to your partners and try to build on these heavens of stability to try to create a spillover. Don't forget that now, Tunisia, which is the nascent hope for democracy in the region, is extremely vulnerable and fragile and directly threatened by the upheaval in Libya and in Kasserine, on its western side by this terrorist group. And development and security have to go hand in hand.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes to take some questions or some reactions from everybody before we move on to the next panel. Would you like to, is there a microphone? Just here, please. Just keep it very short and remind us who you are. Yes, here in the middle, thank you. Yeah, just pass the microphone along. Thank you.
Hi there, thank you. My name's Yaki Sle. I'm from the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. I thought that those were very useful and interesting remarks, but I thought that perhaps the inclusion deficit in North Africa wasn't sufficiently addressed. I mean, the Arab Spring is very much the absence of because of the democratic deficit, the lack of inclusion, both economically and politically, that we see in North Africa, and that lies at the heart of what's to come in the Middle East. So it's useful, I think, to point to what's happening in Europe and the need for greater cooperation and collaboration. Those are important things, but I think it's also probably quite necessary to look closer to home at what is the challenges that lie at the heart of what happened in North Africa. And these are problems of political and economic exclusion. So I just wondered if you'd like to respond to that.
Thank you. I'd particularly like to turn to you, Carla, on that, on the European side, because, of course, one of the great features of the European model is a focus on social inclusion. Europeans are famously much less tolerant of inequality than Americans, for example. And the EU has tried to export its model globally in terms of looking at issues of inclusion, also of trying to ensure that the socioeconomic dimension is also part of foreign policy. Is that going to remain there as Europeans feel more and more threatened, or are they going to become more and more selfish?
Well, I think as we focus more on the neighborhood, and we will be forced to focus more on the neighborhood because of the problems that are there, we need to look at sort of the more fundamental issues. I mean, we go back to the Arab Spring, and I remember the key phrase that was there in the political debate everywhere was to be on the right side of history. We did expect democracy to be all around the Arab world within 6 months, 9 months, or something like that, and you could give it a push with a couple of bombs. That was the prevailing, if not wisdom, then at least view at that particular time. Now we look at we should have looked at that time as well, on the structural issues. I mean, look at this particular region. If you take the entire Middle East and North Africa, and then I go somewhat beyond the neighborhood policy, it's roughly 400 million people. It's an economy altogether that is $2.5 trillion. EU would be 13, 14 trillion. We are the giant that influences them in X numbers away. They have non-oil exports, all of the countries together, that are less than the exports of Belgium, which is not one of the industrial powerhouses of Europe, might be said. They have the highest rates of unemployment in the world, particularly among young people. Employment of women at the best a quarter, at the best, normally well below that. I mean, the structural issues here, and add to that population. I mean, they are now roughly 400 million. By sort of 2-3 decades, there will be 50% more. They need economic growth, according to the IMF, in the order of 7% a year in order to keep unemployment at these levels. And they are now, at the best, at the level of 3. They need to transform their economies. This can only be done in deep integration with Europe, because Europe is nearby, and Europe is the economic giant that is the potential when it comes to transforming their economies and societies. If this happens, yes, they will have a bright future together with us. If it doesn't happen, then we are heading for hurricane.
So how much can the EU help with the hurricane? Morocco has been, for example, negotiating a mobility partnership with the EU for many years, and it doesn't seem to be any closer to a conclusion. Is that because the countries of North Africa don't necessarily want everything the EU is trying to offer? How much of the model is really relevant for the needs of the region?
Well, I think to answer your question, and probably can't build developments about transformative, I don't think that the EU policies have been transformative enough. For long, we have blamed the Arab nationalism and its failure to lift up the Arab society and Muslim societies, to the level they should know. But unfortunately, the soft power, the European soft power, did not succeed to make this transformation. And my country has been claiming, and I think Mr. Belt, who has been Minister of Foreign Affairs, for a very long time, this type of help, including for immigration. I have found articles I had written in 1992, and Europe would say, no, you take care, of thinking that the trade-off, which was in the PM, of more development in the south, less migration to the north, control of terrorism, you do have this bad role, will work. It didn't work. because we did not have enough resources, and we were denied the resources at that time to do that. But now it's a bit late. It's just too much to cope with. And I do think that we do need as well more coordination between Europe and, for instance, my country, to take care of Africa, because this is the strategic depth, and the migration starts, from there. So we do have to cope. So we have a very strong now projection, towards Africa, but we know we can't do it alone. That's why we have started on this very large issue of Atlantic dialogues, trying to link between as well South America and Africa, and make sure that we have the necessary signages to face the tremendous problem, to start with food security, and which is really the basic problem now to address, and we tend to forget that as well. So, Europe is offering a lot, but sometimes you would prefer the manner of offering as well, associating more in the elaboration. And for instance, we have le statut avancé, but somehow it's, it's an empty shell. We do have to fill it ourselves and try to have, and when you bump into large and big issues, there are no resources. There is a shortage of resources. And you can go nowhere if you don't have, tremendous resources to address the magnitude of the problems and of the challenges.
Yes, it does seem rather, it's an adaptation of Tony Blair's famous phrase that Europe's getting tough on migration, but not the causes of migration. We're still waiting to see something longer term.
Yeah, no, we can all be critical of migration policies, but at the end of the day, that's not the issue. We cannot solve the problems of the Maghreb countries, North Africa and the Middle East, by moving the entire population to Europe because of the failure of these countries to reform. That's simply not going to work, and it would be morally wrong. These countries will have to reform themselves. You might say that the policies of Europe are weak. Yes, there are limits to what we can do. We can offer them possibilities, opportunities, perhaps models, perhaps aid, but at the end of the day, the change will have to come within these countries themselves. We can't do it. And for example, we can offer deep and comprehensive free trade agreements of the sort that we've done now towards the East. They are fairly demanding in terms of what you need to do in your economy, but they also give enormous possibilities. The fact that Tunisia is doing, problems, needless to say, but Tunisia has been doing slightly better, is to a large extent, or to some extent, a product of the fact that they have used the economic integration possibilities over the last few decades, even under Ben Ali, with Europe better than others. But these things don't come easily, they don't come fast, they will have to come inside these countries. We can help, but we can't do it. And migration, it's an issue, absolutely, huge challenge, but it's not the solution to the problems of these countries.
Yeah, and yet it's the focus at the moment of
It's
the policy
at the
debate.
moment, obviously.
But we've got to look long term. Thank you. I'm afraid we have to hand over to the next panel. So I invite John Peter of The Economist to come up and chair. But I'd like to invite you to thank our panellists who've been great.
I just